Everyone. I hope that you're all having a wonderful day today. As it stands right now, the plan for today is for Anthony and I to have a roughly 30-minute discussion where we talk about our experiences, we talk about the Latinx Humanist Alliance, and also where we get to have just a fun sort of casual conversation with each other about what it's like being a Latinx, a Latin, or a Latino or Latina humanist in the United States. For those of you who don't know me, since I went ahead and started speaking first, I'll give a very brief introduction. My name is Luciano Joshua Gonzalez Vega. I am a non-binary writer living in Greensboro, North Carolina. I am a pretty frequent-ish writer for The Humanists, and I'm also one of the two co-chairs of the Latinx Humanist Alliance, alongside my good friend Anthony.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Anthony Cruz. I use he, they pronouns. I'm located in the unceded land of the Massachusetts people, also known as Boston. And I also co-chair the Latinx Humanist Alliance. I am a humanist chaplain as well as a celebrant, and really looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, I hope that everyone is having a wonderful experience at the conference so far. I wanted to go ahead and briefly talk about the Latinx Humanist Alliance to begin before Anthony and I start talking about our more personal and hopefully still relatable lived experiences. But the Latinx Humanist Alliance is the newest alliance to join the AHA. It began in 2018 and has been going on since then. I am one of the two co-chairs, as I previously mentioned. I've been one of the two co-chairs since the very beginning of the organization. And I know that there are probably people who are going to be interested in hearing why we are called the Latinx Humanist Alliance. So I think that that's probably as good a place as any to begin some of the stuff that I wanted to talk about. The reason why we initially decided to be called the Latinx Humanist Alliance is that we wanted the most inclusive possible title for the organization. And Latinx is one of several different alternatives to the conventional Latino or Latina identifiers in both English and in Spanish, although Latinx is largely used among English speakers and in English speaking spaces. And Latin is a little bit more popular among Spanish speakers, although neither term is enormously accepted so far. I know that there are lots of people who have read and have annoyingly written articles talking about the relative unpopularity of the term Latinx. And there are people who've come up to me and been like, so why did you decide to name the organization, or why did you decide to name the alliance that? I think that's a very interesting way to approach someone, because it suggests that we should do things based on popularity. And if you are a Latinx, Latin, or Latino or Latina humanist, you know better than to try and base things on how popular they are. Because I'm going to be honest, I have been a humanist in Latin America and in the American South, and it is not a popular thing to be. I personally don't really put much weight behind the popularity of things. I think that there are valid considerations as to like the usefulness of terms like Latinx and Latin, but ultimately, as a non-binary person who uses non-binary pronouns, I use they them pronouns personally. I really like Latinx, and I also really like Latin. I like things that give people more ability to self-identify and see themselves in language. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luciano. I think that you're really pointing to kind of the ways in which both the linguistics and the cultural meet, right? As a person who has been born and raised in the island of Puerto Rico, particularly, and through my childhood have lived in the Midwest, in the South, everywhere across the United States, I have found that similar to the statement that you're making, right? I think that there is a distinction between the lived reality and experiences of the human person, the human condition, and then we get into more like linguistics or academic or philosophical conversations. And I find that if we are really looking to engage in a humanism that is both organic, that it's alive, and that it's keeping an ear to the ground, I find that it's very important for us to look not just at the different discourses or debates or the tensions of concepts, and more around the goal that they are trying to achieve, right? And I find that both the Latinx and the Latino or Latine, I find that they're really trying to address the creation of spaces that are really looking to create radical inclusivity, and not just inclusivity, but really visibilizing communities that have for a long time felt either discriminated, erased, marginalized, invisibilized, both within organizations as well as within like academic discourses.
Yeah. So do you want to take a second to begin our conversation about the 1 in 5, or would you like for me to do that?
Luciano, I'll let you do that.
So yeah, so one of our big projects over here at the LHA has been the 1 in 5 project. 1 in 5 is our sort of cutesy little way of referring to the fact that despite the relative non-presence of Latinx, Latino, or Latina humanists in media and in conversations about religiosity among Latin Americans, there are a surprising number of Latinx and Latine humanists throughout the United States. Specifically, around the number differs slightly from the figures that we have posted, because the original figure that we posted was, I think, gathered from like the mid 2010s. But right now it's roughly somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 Hispanic Latinx people in the United States are members of the religious nuns community, which means that we don't self-identify as members of any particular faith. This is a really important thing, and we over here at the LHA have a special emphasis on getting people to acknowledge that. Some of the ways that we've done this is we've helped put up billboards in different parts of the country. We reached out to religious journalists. Several of us have been interviewed for different articles. Anthony has been interviewed, I've been interviewed, and Juem, Dr. Navarro Rivera, who was also one of our co-chairs in the past, have been interviewed for different articles talking about religiosity among Latinx, Latine, and Hispanic people. Also, for anyone curious, because this is probably a thing that's going to be brought up later, the difference between Hispanic and Latino is that Hispanic refers to someone who comes from a Spanish language background, whereas Latino refers to someone from Latin America. So basically, if you are from Belize, where the official language is not Spanish, or if you're from French Guiana or from Brazil, you are Latino, but you're not Hispanic. Yeah.
Talking about, Luciano, geographical realities. In my case, I found humanism particularly around 2014, 2015, particularly engaging in Facebook and online searching around being, for example, in my case, an anthropology student, right? And looking at different categories of self-identification, right? So I was putting like Latino, humanist, like all these different concepts, right? Until I found, for example, the Humanist Institute back when it was an independent organization. And that particular program that was a graduate certificate really allowed for me to explore my emergent identity as what I consider a free thinker, right? And I find that those spaces where we are able to rethink ourselves and really begin to engage in the different histories, narratives, and epistemologies of the humanist, free thinking, agnostic, atheist, right? Heretic, all these different adjectives for the work that we are doing, at least through the AHA, I think it's very important. I mean, again, I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, which is a US colony. And for me, has been very important in the past few years to really begin to explore my own identity as an Afro-Boricua, right? And looking at some of the realities around colonization, imperialism, and the way in which identity is really contested, and it becomes at one point very personal. And I find that it would be to our benefit as a humanist organization to really begin to dialogue, converse, a little bit of pun there, right? Between what we're trying to do from an intellectual philosophical dimension, right, in terms of our relationship to like religiosity and so forth, but also where are we creating the spaces to be able to look at the personal or the human experience and really listen to the needs that people are clearly stating. For example, when we look at different surveys from like the nuns, right, asking different questions, and to some extent they are really trying to address something, right? There's a lack that traditional faith or religious communities are not providing. And how are we not just looking at, yes, they're living faith, yes, they're leaving their traditional religious backgrounds, but what are we providing to
Yeah.
the individuals? I think it's a very important question for us.
I have the unpleasant experience of being a Twitter atheist. And I'm actually like, I have several friends who are very well known in that sort of space. I sometimes come across people who are stridently anti-religious, which is understandable. I'm a historian. There was a point in my life when I was stridently anti-religious, but I sometimes come across people who ask questions like, what is the purpose of churches in a non-religious world, or how can we get people to leave churches behind? And I think it's really important that we, especially those of us who are humanists of color, which I am not. I am both fully Hispanic and fully white. My family was Italian and Irish before they came to Puerto Rico. So I don't claim to be a person of color. I'm just a white man who is also Hispanic. But I'm one of the people who raises the point that churches throughout the United States provide a number of objective benefits, even if you are not religious. Among other things, churches are one of the big providers of charities. They are often food pantries and shelters for the homeless. For Hispanic people specifically, churches are some of the only places where if you are undocumented, you can find all sorts of relief and sanctuary from their organizations such as ICE. And also, if you are just a person of color, almost regardless of the sort of person of color that you are, there is a wide history of churches being used as organizations and organizing spaces for civil rights movements. So I think that humanists need to have conversations about how it is that we can begin to provide services that will allow people who are non-religious to not feel like they have to go to churches anymore. And this is something that more and more people have started doing over the course of the last couple of years, which is something that I'm really grateful for. I've helped people have these sorts of conversations. Um, I also wanted to take a second to talk about how I first heard about the term humanism, because I heard about it in a really pop culture sort of way. When I was younger, I was a big fan of The Office, and there is a deleted scene from an episode in season 4 where Michael is talking to people about curses and religions, and he talks to Oscar of all people, and he's like, Oscar, are you Catholic? And Oscar's like, no, I'm a humanist. So I think it's very interesting that someone who is a conservative in that show, like explicitly, and also Hispanic, is the person to be like, no, I'm a humanist, which goes to show the wide range of people who can be humanists. I was raised in Latin America. I was raised in Honduras, Colombia, and Panama. And I went to high school in Honduras. And by the time I left Honduras, I was already a humanist. I just didn't have the vocabulary for it. I didn't know that that was an option, which is one of the things that happens when you're raised in Latin America. You don't really get told that there are people who are non-Christian and also people who are like queer, which was a thing that happened to me. I'm both, and I realized that about myself in the United States when I was older. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Luciano. And I think that, as you're stating, really shows that there's a multiplicity of ways in which we evolve and change and transform and adapt as we begin to gain particular language and access to particular communities, right? Like I stated before, like I had the opportunity while I was finishing my undergrad studies to be part of the Humanist Institute. And I found that organization, particularly by having read Chris Stedman's book, Faithist, right? Because I found in that memoir, particularly, that he echoed a lot of the sentiments that I had around being raised Christian, both Catholic and Protestant, if we hold that tension, and developing a queer identity, but still having a form of connection because of family, because of culture, right, to faith communities, and not necessarily finding a place where I could really flourish as a humanist. And I think that that comes to show that if we are looking at the bigger picture or a broader map around particularly the Caribbean, which is my main positionality, even though I now live in Boston, I find that, as Fernando Pico states, who was a Puerto Rican historian, I love a quote that he has, that he defines that the Caribbean is much more than a sea represented on maps. The word Caribbean conjures up a cluster of island languages, peoples, minds, color, aromas, intonations, rhythms, and rituals, right? And I find that, again, in the Caribbean, particularly Puerto Rico, in such a small island, we have Afro-Caribbean religions, spiritualities, Catholicism being predominantly, right, the dominant force in terms of religiosity, Protestantism, Judaism, Islam, and other traditions, all of that, right, clustered in an island, and humanist thought as well that cuts across all these different traditions. And I find that in my own experience, serving in the Latinx Humanist Alliance, serving in other spaces as well, to kind of represent humanism in its different intonation, in its different embodiments, I find that we should be able to embrace and center our cultural hybridity, right? If we are really serious about engaging the younger generations, if we are really not just looking at the statistics around nuns, but we want to accompany and we want to provide spaces where these people are not just able to think themselves into new communities, right? As Benedict Anderson states, like imagined communities, right? What are we providing to them, right? What is the counterforce that we are providing people that are deciding to leave their traditional religious, spiritual communities and saying, you know what, I'm a humanist, I'm an atheist, I'm agnostic, I'm a free thinker, I'm a heretic, or questioning, which is a particular concept utilized more in higher education, right, and by undergrad and graduate students. And how are we responding to that?
Yeah. So my actual history in movement, both atheism and humanism, is related to a lot of what you just talked about. When I first realized that I was an atheist, it was 2014, and I was in college. The truth is that I had already been an atheist for a while. I just didn't have the vocabulary, and I didn't realize that, like, as a Hispanic person, that was really an option. It was when I went to college and I was a college freshman that I was like, oh, hey, this is stuff that can apply to me without it meaning that, like, I'm a bad person. And I, as a Hispanic person, I started immediately going online and talking about atheism. I was quickly invited to several different groups. And not too long after the Secular Latino Alliance formed, which is one of the biggest online Hispanic atheist groups, I was asked if I wanted to come on and be an admin by Sal Villarreal, who is the founder of the Secular Latino Alliance and is still a good friend of mine. I'm actually still one of the admins for the Secular Latino Alliance. It was after that that I joined the Hispanic American Freethinkers, which is a more on the ground organization that does stuff like We get together and have community dinners in the DC/DMV area. We also give scholarships to different students, especially students studying the sciences who are Hispanic atheists. And then it was after that, my most recent, I guess, sort of addition to an organization was actually the Latinx Humanist Alliance when it was first formed. But at that point, I had already known Dr. Navarro Rivera, who was one of the founders, and I was already well acquainted with Rachel, who is one of the people over at the AHA. So it is because of the online work that I did, creating communities and also helping people, that I was able to get the opportunity to join the LHA. But that was difficult at first, because when I first started talking about atheism on the internet, I was effectively an island. I didn't know anyone in the movement. The reason that I actually deconverted explicitly was that when I was a college freshman, I started looking at videos of different religious speakers from different religions and also atheistic speakers. And I started realizing more and more that atheism was where I fell as far as religion went. I do have a powder keg moment, funnily enough. This isn't like a very common thing in my experience among the people that I've talked to, but for me, the explicit powder keg moment that I realized that I was an atheist was I went to go and see the movie God's Not Dead. And at that point, I was still clinging to my religion. I was still like, yeah, I still believe all of this stuff. I'm trying to like mix all of it together and make it make sense. But that movie was actually like, when I left that movie theater, I looked at my partner, who was a Christian and is no longer a Christian, and is also a friend of mine now. I looked at her and I was like, yeah, so I'm an atheist. And I figured you should be the first person to know, since you and I live together. Um, but I think that I'm very lucky to be able to do the things that I do, even though that luck is in part because I'm so aggressive and outspoken. Not everyone is as privileged as I am to be able to safely talk about the things that I talk about without fearing backlash from their employers or their families or their friends. What I'm hoping to do is I'm hoping to create a safer world where people can be more honest about their views, and they can do so without being afraid of the social backlash that they'll face.
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for that. I feel pulled in so many directions, because I find that we're touching upon access to higher education as like a crossroads of wills, right? We're talking about migration or immigration and some of the tension and reality that that brings, and where are the humanist communities, right, in that intersection of migration or immigration, and what kind of support are we providing? And I find as well that to some extent, you're also talking about mentorship and relationships. And I find that all of them, as we were talking about cultural hybridity and the multiplicity that that evokes in our human experience and the ways that we express and move ourselves in the world, I find that all of them come together, right? We need people that are able to serve as mentors. Not everybody can, particularly in the humanist free thought, agnostic, atheist, whatever community. And I think that that's a very important dimension and element that is kind of missing to some extent in our communities, right? Which is a little bit more prominent in other theist or religious communities, where you're taking under the wing of the pastor or priest or whatever their title is, right? And they're really providing a livelihood network. They're really providing that safety net that a lot of times is kind of missing when we are, as you mentioned, Luciano, doing a deconversion process and saying, I identify as this and no longer with my traditional community. Where do I go from there? Right? If I'm losing my connection with my family or my spouse or my siblings or my known community since I was born, what is the alternative? Where do I turn? And I think that that is also tied, particularly in North America and other parts of the world as well, the stigma around unbelief, right? And the pain that comes with that.
I think that there is a lot of fear and pain when it comes to this sort of thing. And I think, honestly, I think it's valid to be afraid. Like, I'm not going to police someone's emotional reaction, because even though I had a powder keg moment where I realized just immediately in that, over the course of like those, I think it was like almost 2 hours, I realized that I was an atheist. I was still afraid, because I knew that like I could either choose to lie to the people that I cared about, or I could be honest with them and risk losing maybe not their love, but risk losing their respect and also their like companionship and their friendship. And I feel like everyone who is deconverted to an extent understands this fear, but it is immense. It is a very powerful thing in the Latinx, Latin, and Hispanic communities, because for us, religion is like, for those of us who are religious, religion is unbelievably important. It is a super significant aspect of our lives. It's something that we dedicate our lives to, and there are portions of our culture that are effectively hand in hand with religion. So if you sunder that relationship, if you vocally state that you are non-theistic, even to an extent, if you state that you're a member of a different religion, you'll still feel that. But being non-religious is so much worse. And I did this both times. There were times during my early life when I wasn't a Christian and I was vocal about that. That is something that I personally experienced. I can attest to the fact that, at least for me, it was worse when I was like, I am no longer a believer, than when I was like, oh, I believe in a lot of different gods coexisting all at once, which was my personal belief for a not insignificant portion of my life, actually.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, similar to your story, I find that, at least in my case, in order for me to make the transition from living in Puerto Rico and graduating from my undergrad studies and being able to explore humanism in its more organized dimension, I had to move to the States, right? Which meant I need to move, right? And not having family, particularly in any of the states, I fled to academia. I fled to graduate school. And the only place that I was really able to apply to get a full ride, find housing, find a meal plan, right? All of those things that are really required. I applied to theology school, already being open and saying, I identify as a humanist and I want to do interreligious engagement, right? And being admitted, being accepted, and really in that time, finding, for example, the Humanist Hub in Boston at that time, particularly, and finding, again, like I mentioned really early on, those mentors and those figures and models that are able to represent both the beauty of finding the embodied philosophical and life stance that we have discovered, right? And the potentiality of livelihood, and which obviously led me to continue my studies and now being a chaplain, right? Which I find that it's a really beautiful, emergent, and contested space, particularly from a humanist perspective, and where are the different supports from different organizations to be a chaplain that's openly a humanist, and how are we really representing our organizations, representing our different demographics, communities, in order to really be able to bring more equity, more justice, more freedom, which I think it's a humanist value and atheist value, right? That I think we would all agree on is how we're really bringing more freedom to our societies.
Hey, Nicole.
Hi, that seems like a good place to move on to the question and answer portion of the session. We have several very interesting questions waiting for you. The first is from John Lombard. What can be done not just to be not just more inclusive in terms of welcoming people from the Latinx community within the AHA, but to actively reach out to people and make them feel wanted and involved. And do you think this is being done effectively now, or what more can the AHA do? And also not only the AHA, but also our local chapters.
Mm-hmm. Anthony, you're not a newcomer to the LHA, but you're someone who came in after it was created. So I'd love to hear your take on this before I say my own.
Sure, thank you. And I'll use a timer for that. I'll try to keep it under 2 minutes. I find that, first of all, is my own understanding and realization that in order to make a trailblazing pathway, we need to be present, right? We have to make a decision to say, you know what, I am going to sacrifice myself in my young adult life, right, in order to really make sure that there are spaces for the younger generations, which means that we, to some extent, are aware of the trauma, that we are aware of the lack of cultural sensibilities, the training, moving away from a monochromatic understanding of what does it mean to be Latino, Hispanic, or holding different cultural identities. And I find that we have a long way to go as humanist communities. But I would say that in my own case, right, it was finding mentors that really continue to help me through my academic journey, writing letters of recommendations, providing financial support, providing counsel, advice, and just being present through the thick and the thin. I think that, again, cuts through different humanist communities.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and also try to keep my answer fairly brief because I know we have a bunch of interesting questions. I think the most important thing that we could probably do is platforming Latinx people in a wide variety of ways. I have been very lucky in this respect because in addition to being a member of the LHA and one of the co-chairs, I was also able to work as an intern over at the AHA. I have helped the AHA and the LHA in a wide variety of contexts. One of the things that I did was I helped us do Hispanic Heritage Month a few years ago, which I know a lot of people, myself included, are sometimes rightfully exhausted with Hispanic Heritage Month, but it is a very important way of platforming and having conversations about Hispanic and Latinx people. And it's also basically a lot of free airtime, which is something that is really appreciative. I myself tend to keep a watch out for what different secular organizations are doing to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. And I'm very excited to see what we do this year. Yeah.
Great. There's also, I noticed in the community boards, Debbie Allen from Secular Coalition for America made some posts about a secular Day of the Dead celebration. Yeah. That's sort of gaining steam for people who like the celebration itself without the religious content that it has. Here's a person, I'm going to get the name wrong, Megas Glidewell, asking if it's appropriate to just say Central and South America as a term. That it seems more clear than saying, I guess, Central America and South America, or
so
what distinctions need to be made?
Yeah, so I'll talk about this for a second. I'm actually a historian. I am a historian specializing in modern Central American history. I wish I could have specialized in Caribbean history as well, but my university didn't really offer that. There are a lot of different cultural distinctions between South and Central America. If someone wants to get like really in the weeds about it, they could even make distinctions between different portions of Central America and like different parts of South America, all of which I think are valid. I think using the terms, I feel like using the terms for the sake of expediency is often acceptable, especially if you know what you're talking about. And if you're like, if I'm going to be talking about a specific place, a specific part of Latin America, I will say that specific part. But for the sake of saving time, let's talk about Latin America, or let's talk about South or Central America. It's fine.
Great. This is a more general question, but maybe you have some interesting perspective on it. Don McGillis is asking, how would you balance the various words we can use, atheist, agnostic, humanist, non-believer? Do each of you have preferences, or do you use them all at different times, or how would you?
I took the last one, so I want to make sure that you have a chance, Anthony.
Sure. I mean, thank you for that question. I think that it's getting to the point around what are themes and topics that are of interest to the younger generations, younger people under 35, right? And I think that this is one of them, right? It's, for example, saying, I hold humanistic values, but I don't like the term humanist. I've heard, right, as I lecture in universities and in other spaces, even though the organization might call itself humanist, fill in the blank, right? But I think, again, it's really getting to the nitty-gritty of how are we claiming, reclaiming, and self-defining our traditions of unbelief, for example. At least in my case, I like using the term free thinker because I can play with that concept in different ways. And I do feel more connected to my own Afro-Caribbean traditions of seeing different libre pensadores and free thinkers throughout histories, right? Kind of doing that intersectional play around academia, higher education, and their own identities and commitments to our self-determination as a people.
Do you wanna see? I wonder if we have enough time for one more. Would you like to see if we can answer one more, Nicole? Or
sure. Now the pressure is on for me to find the right.
I feel like this
Okay.
just isn't enough time.
So again, this is a little more general, but maybe you can answer specifically from the Latinx experience. Is there a Christian atheism involving the humanistic values of Christianity? That's from Anne Krauss.
I definitely think that there can be. I know a lot of people who want to, I know people who want to take the best of both Christianity and non-theism, regardless of what specific label you want to apply to it. People who really like the values of Jesus. There's a quote that goes along the lines of, I really like your Jesus, but I don't like your Christians. I can't remember who said it, but my inclination is that it was someone, it was probably Gandhi. I know that it's attributed to Gandhi. I don't know if Gandhi actually said it. But I know a lot of people who really like that point of view. And in my experience, in the Latinx spaces I'm in, that's not an uncommon point of view.
Yeah, thank you for that, Luciano. I would agree with you. I would actually say, I mean, as a chaplain, as a scholar, both in cultural studies and like theology, I find that in different tradition, if not almost all of them, there are humanistic vibes or trends or a presence there that I find that has not been highlighted more often than that, because I mean, you would need to know the tradition and do research, right? But I would say that at least where we stand as a modern society, I find that even when we use concepts like being a theist or being a believer, right? Like I find that we really have to engage in relationship with others in order to really break away from generalizations, because we are a very highly educated, secularized society, even though we have a very theistic popular culture or language. Most people believe in the scientific method. People have all these access to science and different life sciences, right? So like in my experience, it's not just about, oh, let's talk about this and that and reason and free thought and all these things, but really getting to the center around what are we trying to do again as organizations, as individuals, to really promote equity across the board. So yes, I think being literate in terms of like theological language, in terms of religious studies, it's very important, particularly again, if we're really trying to be present, have a seat at the table. I think it's very important.
Thanks so much, Luciano and Anthony.
Have a great
Thank
day,
you.
everyone.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.